To find out how these states got here and what their future holds, let's bring Joe Minarik from the Committee for Economic Development. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, Joe, how does what's happening with the economy in the so-called Rust Belt stack up with what's happening in the rest of the U.S.?
Well, the United States, as you know, is an extraordinarily diverse economy. If you take all of the United States, on average, we're spread over every form of economic activity. We have natural resources, we have agriculture, we have finance, we have manufacturing. The individual parts of the country, of course, are not uniformly diversified. And as a result of that, some of our cities that were located close to reserves of coal, to reserves of metals, which meant that they were natural places for manufacturing to take place. You're on a river, which means that you can move goods and raw materials in and out. Invested heavily in those areas, and those areas have been affected by technology and by changing tastes. And so they have been the parts of the country that have been suffering most recently.
And as you mentioned, these so-called one industry cities, for example, you were saying with coal, and you also have Detroit with the auto industry, they've really had to rebuild themselves. In terms of the progress that's been made, what do you think of it?
Well, it's not an easy thing to diversify when you lose a core of your economic base. It can be very hard. It's a compounding problem, because as one part of your economy shuts down, that puts pressure on all the others that serviced it and the people who worked in it. One of the examples of success in recent years probably has been Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh had the advantage that it had some very strong educational institutions, which meant that it could invest in new forms of technology that don't really require reserves of raw materials, for example. You could go into medical technology, you could go into electronic technology. That is what cities have to try to do, and some cities are better equipped to do that than others.
And speaking of that, you're saying that Pittsburgh had education to rely on, but what about some of these cities who don't have that to rely on? Where do they turn?
Well, Pittsburgh, of course, is a big city, and it had some diversity, and it had these educational institutions. Smaller towns that lived almost entirely off of manufacturing facilities are in real trouble. That's the area where you really have to try to look and see, if you're trying to make that area grow again, what are the resources on which we can build? Sometimes there'll be something there that you can work with. Sometimes it will be very, very hard. And there are small towns in Ohio that have been the subject of articles in the press where you really have tremendous suffering, and it can be very difficult.
Now, Joe, one of the things I want to talk about, looking at the campaign trail, we hear a lot about the free trade deals and the impact that they've had on the decline of jobs in especially these U.S. manufacturing cities. So how much of that is because of cheaper competition abroad versus the fact that the manufacturing industry is changing?
I think a lot of it, when you get down to it, is the changing nature of technology across the board. When you have a change in your trade relationships, very often people do very well servicing those markets. We export more to many of the countries around the world, including the countries that were involved, for example, in NAFTA. You don't pay very much attention to that growth. What captures people's attention is the areas where you have the destructive part of creative destruction. But the changing nature of technology, the advance in productivity in manufacturing means that even where we're very successful in expanding manufacturing output, it does not give you as many jobs as it used to. And you can't ignore that. You can't wish it away.
So with that being said then, as we're seeing these people on the campaign trail saying we're bringing these jobs back, you have some companies like GE really making an effort to start their factories here. Will those jobs of the past ever really come back then?
The jobs of the past are the jobs of the past. New jobs involving very highly skilled and trained individuals will be created, but not as many of them as the old line jobs. You're not going to see the armies of individuals walking through the plant gates to make a little bit of steel. What you're going to see is very highly skilled people, each individually, making a lot of steel.
Well, the times they are indeed changing. We are going to have to leave it there. Joe Minarik, Senior Vice President and Director of Research at the Committee for Economic Development. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.